So, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I'm really honored. I'm Anna Masera. I'm the public editor of La Stampa, and I direct the master's degree in journalism at the University of Torino. And I'm very happy to talk about this book, Becoming the News, How Ordinary People Respond to the Media Spotlight, because in my job, I really have a lot to do with the public and how the public reacts to media, and I am very often, this subject comes up a lot. And so I'm actually excited to hear your speech, Ruth, and I'd like to introduce her for you, who you don't, I mean, how many people here are Italian? Okay, so for the Italian people, it hasn't been translated yet, the book. But it's, you can order it on Amazon. That's how we got it. And Ruth Palmer is, she's an assistant professor of communication at the IU University in Madrid. She's been teaching there for 5 years. She's from Texas, from the USA. And this book was written last year. She's worked on this book, though, for almost 10 years, it seems. And it's a lot of interviews to readers who have been in the spotlight. And so she has really some incredible evidence. And so there's going to be a talk. She has some slides. And then afterwards, we're going to have a discussion. And please raise your hands. We're a small group. We can all, I'm hoping to be able to, allow you to have a conversation with her and ask her questions. So please, Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Welcome.
So I'm very happy to be here. The first thing I feel I should say is that I am not a journalist. I'm a communications scholar, and I study how people who are not journalists think about the news media. So what their attitudes are toward journalists, how they think journalism works. And what I'm presenting here is a slice of that research. So as Anna said, it's just been published as a book, published by Columbia University Press. And this book focuses on the experiences of people who have been named in news stories. So these are not public figures or celebrities, just ordinary people who spoke to journalists for journalist stories. So they were, in some cases, human interest subjects, in other cases, witnesses, quoted as experts, this kind of thing. The book is based on over 80 interviews that I conducted with people who appeared in news stories in the United States, okay? Now, for an audience of journalists, I obviously don't need to make the case that ordinary people play an important role in the news process and in the product, right? But just to sort of put this in perspective, I think, sometimes people say to me, well, this is an old media phenomenon. But if you think about it, the past year or so has really, I think, been kind of a landmark year for ordinary people in at least American news, okay? So here you have hurricane survivors, your typical mass shooting victim and family member of a victim. Here we have ordinary people really driving news in a lot of cases, right? So Time magazine names as their person of the year the silence breakers. Obviously, some of these people are celebrities, but others are just normal people who have spoken out to the press about sexual harassment. Here you have, most recently, on the cover of Time magazine, high school students who survived a mass shooting and have become really major figures in a social movement to endorse gun control, okay? So these are people who play an important role in news, obviously, and yet, for whatever reason, their experiences had not been systematically studied by communication scholars, okay? So this was the impetus behind the book, was to find out what's their experience like, how do they feel about interacting with journalists, and how do they feel about becoming the focus of news attention, okay? I think that I should speak a little bit about the methodology behind the book, but I'm going to give a very brief background, and then I can talk more about it in the Q&A if you're interested. This research began as part of my doctoral dissertation. I got my doctorate at Columbia Journalism School in New York. So I focused on 2 cities. I focused on New York, in the area around New York, and also a city in the Midwestern United States that has 1 newspaper. So in that sense, it's a little bit more of a typical news environment for the United States. And what I did was I contacted, a little bit slower, okay. What I did was I contacted people who had appeared in newspapers. So I saw their names in newspapers, and I contacted them and asked them to sit down and let me interview them about their experience, okay? Now, they had appeared in newspapers, but in a lot of cases, they had also, some of them were in very large news stories. So they had also appeared in other news outlets, so on television, on radio, and in those cases, I asked them to tell me about their whole experience, okay? So I sat down with them in coffee shops, and in parks and in their homes, basically wherever they would meet with me. And I asked them to tell me the whole story. So how they wound up in the news in the first place, what they thought of their interaction with reporters, how they felt about the news stories when they saw them, and anything that happened as a result. They had appeared in the news for a lot of different reasons. Some of them were witnesses to accidents, experts, survivors of catastrophes, subjects of human interest stories, many different kinds of stories. But the one thing that they all had in common was that they were not public figures, okay, or celebrities or journalists. So these were people who did not interact with the news media on a daily basis. And in fact, for many of them, it was the first time they had ever met a journalist, was when they interacted with a journalist for this news story. For many of them, it was also the first time they had appeared in the news, okay? So the book itself is structured to follow this arc of their experience. I have chapters dedicated to the reasons why they wanted to speak to reporters in the first place, their interactions with reporters, how they felt about the stories when they saw them, and then the repercussions of those stories. That's the structure of the book. What I'd like to do today is call your attention to some key quotes. The book is really structured around these sort of chunky quotes from the interviews that I conducted. And I've chosen the quotes because I think that in some cases they just call attention to key ideas, but in others because they call attention to ways that these particular people, ordinary people, saw journalistic processes differently from the way that journalists often do. Now, that sources have a different perspective on this process is obvious in a lot of ways, right? They have different goals for what they want to get out of the process. They have a completely different position in the process. But I think it's important to call attention to where these contrasts really are clear and significant, or I should say I think that they are significant, partly for two reasons. One, it's because this is where ethical concerns really do come up. Because these are not people in positions of power. So if they feel that their interests are really clashing with those of journalists, it does raise some tricky ethical questions. But the second reason I think these moments are significant is because they really give an interesting window into how non-journalists see journalism. Okay? And I think I probably don't have to make the argument that this is an important component of understanding trust, okay, which is pretty much the big theme of this conference. In order to understand trust and try to generate trust, you have to understand how others see you and what you do. Okay, so I've chosen these quotes because I think they give insight into that, okay? The first thing that I want to call attention to is very simple. It's just this. Having an article in the paper is kind of a big deal in a person's life, okay? I think this is important to remember because especially if you are continually addressing a large audience, if you have a platform, it's easy to overlook this, okay? But for the people that I interviewed, even in this day and age of social media, it was a big deal to be named in the paper, okay? This guy, Billy, he was, all of these are pseudonyms, by the way, was featured in the local paper in the Western city that I focused on, okay? It was a big deal in his life, right? So to many subjects, this is a big deal, right? But at the same time, it's also important to keep in mind that media coverage is really just one part of a larger saga that they're living, okay? So we have to keep this in perspective. In a lot of cases, I sat down with people and I tried to get them to focus on the media aspect of their experience, but they wanted to tell me about the thing that had happened before, right? So the plane they were on that crashed, okay? Or the shooting that they were a part of somehow, or the thing that they're an expert in, right? So this makes sense because these are the reasons why journalists approach them in the first place. But I think it's important to remember because since they are deeply implicated in the story in a lot of cases, they think these are their stories, okay? Journalists come in later, right? Before the thing even gets started, before journalists even show up, they feel that this is their story. So to give you a sense of that, at the end, I interviewed several people who were on a plane that crashed in the Hudson River near Manhattan. Some of you may remember this. It was a big media event, and it was called The Miracle on the Hudson. So I interviewed a number of people who were on that plane, who had then gone on to be the focus of media attention. And one of them, Albert, at the end of our interview, looked at me kind of pityingly, and he said this. He said, "Being in Flight 1549 outweighs being in the newspaper by 1,000-fold, okay? So it's important to keep this in perspective, right? At the same time, in sort of bookending this experience, they cared a lot about the repercussions of the news story, okay? Their focus really, in most cases, was not on the content of the story itself. It was what happened as a result, okay? So to give you an example of that, I interviewed a woman named Michelle, who was the subject of a story, a very controversial story, because she was the plaintiff in a lawsuit about religion. She was suing a religious organization. And at the end of the interview, I said, well, how big of part do you think that the media will play in your experience, say, 5 years down the line? And she said this, she said, the hate messages and the consequences of the media stuff, that will play a big part. But just the media itself, not so big. Okay, so you can see here how the underlying event and the consequences later, in a lot of cases, were the things that mattered to them most and shaped the whole experience. In fact, I would say that the underlying event, what I call the trigger event, is the thing that most determines how they experience making the news, right? So if you're in the news because you raped a child, your experience will be fundamentally different from if you're in the news for having saved a child or having lost a child. This is very clear. So the big determinant of someone's experience is not actually anything journalists do. It's the underlying event, okay? So what this means partly, these two quotes taken together, is that from the point of view of a lot of subjects, the whole scenario feels a little bit uneven, or even a lot unequal. Okay, why? Because from their point of view, they're on the ground, they know about this thing, journalists kind of sweep in, appropriate the story, and then exit before the consequences really take place, right? So the whole structure of the thing can feel kind of unequal, right? And yet, the people that I spoke to almost all said it was worth it. Okay, why? Because they got some sort of benefit out of it. Right? And I think to journalists, that's probably clear. Sources get something out of talking to you a lot of the time, right? To the people that I spoke to, those benefits largely came down to the size of the audience that they were hoping to address by being included in a news story. Okay, so that was an audience they did not feel was accessible to them otherwise. And based on what the trigger event was, they had objectives. Okay, so they wanted to address that audience to raise awareness for a cause, to publicize a personal venture, to witness to something they thought was important, or even just increase their status, because there's a lot of status in appearing in the news, right? So they had these motives, and I found that they assessed the overall experience in light of whether or not they had met their objectives. A lot of them were willing to put up with a lot of uncomfortable things, or even what they felt was somewhat distorted reporting, if they felt they had met their objectives. Okay, so what does that look like? I have a pair of slides that I think illustrate this point. I interviewed a woman named Allegra who had had an illness, and it was an illness that was getting a lot of news attention at the time. She lost her baby as a result of this, and when she came out of a coma, she wanted people to know that this was a very dangerous illness for pregnant women. That was not something that was known. So she gave a lot of interviews, right? And she did not enjoy it. She particularly found that TV interviews were very stressful. Often TV crews come into your home and rearrange the furniture. She was a timid woman. She did not like it, right? And so I asked her to talk a little bit about the interaction with the reporters, and she said this. She said, reporters have to be pushy. I got annoyed with some of them, but that's their job. They have to be that way, you know? Like CBS. They really wanted a picture of the baby that I lost, so I assume this is a picture of the fetus, right? And I just refused over and over, and they continually asked until the minute they put it on the air, but that's their job. Okay, I think this is an interesting quote, partly because you can start to see how, by having these conversations, you can see also how people think about journalists. What do they think is normal behavior for journalists, right? And so I went on and I said, well, you seem pretty understanding of what you describe as pushiness. And she said this, she said, well, I was pregnant at the time, and the baby didn't survive because of it, so we felt that if we could at least get this out to one pregnant mom, and she alerts her gynecologist earlier than I did and is saved, then it's helpful. So there may be no more meaningful objective for speaking to reporters than something like this, right? She was willing to put up with a lot if she felt that this objective was met, right? So I think that's an interesting calculation to keep in mind. I want to talk a little bit more about interactions with journalists, because this is a big part of the book, and I think something that would be interesting to you. Now, most of the people that I spoke to, I would say, or certainly a lot of them, actually liked the journalists that they met a lot. They felt they were professional, they were friendly, and they had a good exchange with them. I am actually going to highlight some of the more negative experiences, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind. They were not all negative. However, I think it's some of these, we can learn a lot from the more negative experiences, partly because some of the things that bothered subjects, I think actually will be familiar to you because from the other side of the encounter. Okay, these are things that are actually, I think, fairly common in some cases in reporting practice. So, but what I can show you is what it looks like from the other side. I'm not going to tell you what I think best practice should be because I have too much respect for what you do to do that, and I'm not a journalist myself. But I can give you some insight into what this can feel like from a subject's point of view. Okay, so one of the things that came up very frequently was that people said they felt kind of manipulated into saying certain things. And the version of this that I heard over and over was that they felt that the journalist already had a quote in mind that they were trying to get the subject to say. Okay? So just to illustrate what this looks like from their point of view, I interviewed a woman who was an Ivy League professor, and she was a sort of one of the world's foremost authorities in a particular field, okay, on a particular topic. And she was approached by a number of reporters to give a quote about a new popular product that related to her area of expertise. Okay, so the New York Times called, a New Yorker reporter called, and they wanted her to give a comment about this. And she said to a particular reporter for a big paper, well, I would like to see it. I want to see the product. I want to interact with it first so I can give you a comment. And the reporter said, well, there's no time for that. The story's due on Saturday. And she said, well, maybe you could describe it for me. And so he described it, and then she told me that this is what the exchange was like from her point of view. She said, so then we had quite a pleasant conversation in which the reporter described the product, and I made some comments. But it was very clear to me that he had a storyline for his article, and that involved asking a professor whose field this was, and that person would be aghast. And I said, well, how could you tell? And she said, oh, I mean, it was transparent. It really was, did I not approve of this or disapprove of this? He had that storyline, and I could tell it to such a degree that I had to keep resisting it very consciously. It was inaccurate, and I don't like being scripted. Okay, so I heard a version of this from a number of different people who felt that journalists were pushing them to say a particular thing, and they really didn't like it. Okay, from their point of view, it felt like journalists weren't listening to what they really had to say. And it felt like they were being pushed by journalists to misrepresent themselves. Okay, so again, from subject's point of view, they're concerned about the repercussions of having been, quoted in a paper as saying something that they do not believe, right? In most cases, they did feel like they kind of told the reporter what the reporter wanted to hear. In Bella's case, she felt she was able to resist doing that, but she also said, I've spent so much time resisting saying what he clearly wanted me to say that I wasn't able to say anything of substance at all. And so she found that very frustrating because she doesn't have many opportunities to address the public about her area of expertise, right? In fact, I was recently in touch with her to let her know that the book had been published, and she said, yeah, I remember that. I really didn't like that. She said it out of the blue. What she remembered was this, that she'd been pushed to say something she didn't want to say. So it made an impression on her. There's a broadcast version of this, a TV version. And this is where, a subject feels like the journalist off camera is trying to push them to say a particular thing. So I want to show you in a couple of slides what that looks like. In general, the people that I interviewed found TV equipment very intimidating. And I think it was partly because they tended to be interacting with it immediately after they had just experienced something that was quite jarring. So then the equipment was not familiar, it was intrusive. They felt often sort of pressured to participate in interviews in those situations, partly because just the equipment was kind of so intimidating to them. So to give you a sense of what this looks like, I interviewed a woman named Deanne who had seen she had witnessed an accident in New York that was distressing. And she described being approached by a TV crew this way. She says, so I saw the reporter and her crew. I think she had a little posse of 3 people with her. But the minute I said, yeah, I was here, yeah, I saw what happened, I didn't expect that immediately she was going to say, Harry, turn on the lights, and I was going to have a microphone in my face, right? There was just no transition. She never said, would you be willing to discuss it? It was just, boom, we're in it, right? So she feels like she felt like she couldn't stop the interview once it was going, but it got going much more quickly than she was comfortable with, right? But then what happened next was actually even more interesting. okay? What happened next was that she felt that the reporter started using this very phony voice to try to get her to emote for the camera, okay? So what she said about it was this. She said, I just felt immediately, I just got a fake vibe from this woman. This woman is the reporter, okay? She said this in a phony voice. She says, ooh, that must have been hard. It was fake, it was cheesy. It was like she's giving me these knowing, sympathetic looks, and I was like, how the hell did I get here? What am I doing, right? So it felt to her like the reporter had suddenly switched her demeanor completely as soon as the camera went on. Because the reporter had been very, very businesslike beforehand, and then the camera went on, and all of a sudden she was so sympathetic, right? I also heard a slightly different version of this, which was that in some cases the reporter seemed very friendly, and then the camera went on and they seemed very adversarial, okay? So it's the switch that throws people off. Right? They don't like that because in normal interactions, people don't do that. It seems fake, right? And yet, I think perhaps for journalists accustomed to switching and going into sort of a professional demeanor on camera, it's just kind of part of the job, right? But for the people that I interviewed, that aspect of it could really throw them off, okay? I want to talk about errors, okay? I think this is a particularly interesting topic because the people I interviewed assessed error very differently from the way that news professionals usually assess error, okay? The best way I can summarize it is that they seemed to measure the severity of errors on an effects-based scale. So they cared a lot about errors that they felt had negative effects on either their objectives or on their reputations. But they were very dismissive of small factual errors, okay? The kinds of errors that I think make a lot of journalists kind of wince, that are clearly factually incorrect. Most of the people I interviewed didn't care about those, okay? So to continue here with Deanne, she said, and I should say actually that a lot of the people I interviewed did not remember whether there were technical or factual errors in the stories. At the end of the interview, I showed them the story. And they went through and they said, oh, this is an error, this is an error, this is an error. So in a lot of cases, these little factual errors they didn't even remember them, okay? So here she's talking through looking at the story, okay? And she said, obviously, saying something about 82nd Street, that's an error. So she's pointing at it in the text. Because the incident occurred at 72nd, not 82nd. But just selecting parts of my quotes, that's manipulating. To me, a factual error, it's not a big, you're not screwing with people's lives with a factual error, okay? So the errors that bothered them usually were errors of omission, so something they thought was really important to the story was left out, or errors of over and under emphasis. So reporters had chosen to emphasize or de-emphasize things that they felt were essential to getting the story right, okay? So unfortunately, I think the upshot of this is that they did not report errors, because they didn't care about the little technical ones, and the ones they cared about, they knew reporters were not going to correct. I think it's also worth saying that they felt intimidated, right? So in a lot of cases, they did not feel that news organizations were transparent and open to them. The reporting process was kind of a black box to a lot of people. They didn't know much about how reporting worked, so they weren't sure how errors had happened or how to get them fixed, right? I interviewed a woman named Annie who was featured in the West City paper for her job, and she had kind of an adventurous job, and it had been for a profile about this job. And the reporter had said that she had traipsed over mountains, but she hadn't been to mountains. And so she felt like that was an error in the story, okay? And I was asking her about it, and she was sort of musing about this error and what it meant to her. And she said this, she said, I now know that they make things up. Right? I always kind of speculated that they did that, but I didn't know. But they do that, they really do, right? And it's not like it's something that's that important, but. And I said, well, did it occur to you to contact the reporter and set the record straight? And she said, no, it wasn't that important, right? To me, it wasn't what the story was about anyway, right? So this is not an error that interferes with her main objectives for the story. It's not the main point of the story. It's not worth correcting. Right? But I think here, once again, you get a sense of how people actually are thinking about journalism in general. And it does kind of make you wince, right? Let's talk about repercussions, okay? So this is, as I said before, something that is very important to news subjects, is what happens as a result of the story. So in a sense, if there are no repercussions, it's almost as though the story didn't even happen, right? The most immediate repercussions that they notice are the effects on the way that their friends and family react to them. So I should say that there's so much status in being named in a news story still today that unless the story is negative or really paints the person in a negative light, people generally noticed that their status got a bump, right? So people congratulated them. The story circulated on social media. They got a lot of congratulations just for appearing in the media at all, or in a news outlet at all, right? But there are people who are depicted as having done something bad really got a lot of negative feedback. It can be a very damaging thing. And the people who have the most difficult time of it are people depicted as criminals. Okay, so I should say here, in the United States, the convention is to report the names of people who are accused and convicted criminals. I know in some countries that is not the case. In the US, we name our criminals, okay? This can be very, very damaging, obviously, to people's immediate social circles and in the long run, which I'll talk about more in a minute. I interviewed a woman named Beth who was who was covered in a number of major news stories because she committed a white-collar crime, okay, so a financial crime. And before it was written about in the paper, people didn't know about it, right? So you could, of course, say, well, it was her own fault, she shouldn't have committed that crime. But of course, the stigma comes from people knowing, right? And that happens because it's reported. So I asked her about what it felt like after the first articles about this were published, and she said, "It is as if a nuclear bomb went off in my life. It was as if every single person I ever knew died. I'm just this total pariah, and I don't even know myself," right? So seeing yourself depicted that way can actually trigger a kind of existential crisis. But also, you know, her children were bullied. She had to change their school. She gained 100 pounds. I mean, it is a very, very difficult thing to go through, right? Now, obviously, the thing we have to think about today with this, and I think one of the things that shapes what it feels like to be in the news today, is that these things circulate online, of course, and search is a major factor here. Okay, so if you are depicted in mainstream news stories do very well in searches, okay, and as Google continues to tweak its algorithm to sort of separate the more established news outlets from the fake stuff, they will do even better. Okay, we've already seen that over time, right? So what this means for, you know, an ordinary citizen named in the news is that if you Google them, these articles come up. And especially in the case of something like this, it's kind of a big news story, they can take up the first several pages of your Google search results, okay? Now, Beth was kind of a techie geek. That's how she described herself. And she took steps to try to hide these articles in her search results by creating websites and linking to them. That worked for a while, but Google changed its algorithm, and that really doesn't work anymore, right? So essentially what this means is, in the US, you know, there's no right to be forgotten. In Europe, you know, that she might have been a candidate for that, right? But in the US, that's not an option. And so these articles can follow you essentially for life. And the worst thing you've ever done can be sort of the first thing anybody knows about you, right? So I think this raises some interesting questions for journalists as well as subjects, because this is something that is a big deal. And it's not something that subjects themselves necessarily think about, okay? So if you're going to be speaking to a journalist about something very personal that happened to you, for example, sexual harassment or something like this, you need to be aware that that is an article that will come up and follow you potentially for your entire life, okay? And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. A lot of the people that I interviewed were not, okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to think about in terms of digital repercussions is cyber harassment, okay? Obviously, this is on the rise. And for people who spoke to journalists, or who speak to journalists about controversial issues, it's a virtual certainty that you will get blowback online. A lot of people don't anticipate this, right? But it can be very, very uncomfortable. So this can come in the form of just seeing comments on articles that attack you personally, or getting direct feedback on social media. And sometimes it can even spill over offline, so in the form of getting letters to your home or your office, which can be alarming because then you know you can feel very vulnerable in that case. So going back to Michelle, who was the plaintiff in the controversial lawsuit, who felt like the repercussions were very, very damaging to her, she said, "I've gotten hate messages on Facebook from people as far away as Canada and as close as here in West City. I've been called at my work and harassed by reporters. It hasn't been fun. It was very frightening, right? Here, it's kind of interesting. She sort of lumps the harassment she was getting from readers into this sort of ongoing harassment from reporters as well. That wasn't so common, okay? What was more common was that people felt that reporters just kind of went away, right, and left them to deal with whatever these repercussions were, right? So they felt a little bit abandoned, which is interesting. And it kind of brings me to my final idea here. As I've sort of indicated throughout these quotes, in a lot of cases, you can see interwoven in them really pretty negative attitudes about, or negative beliefs about what people think journalism is generally like. And I have to say that even though many of the people I spoke to had positive experiences, it was really striking to me how quick they were to label them as exceptions. Okay, so they'd already embraced a pretty negative attitude about journalists' motives in particular. Okay, so what you've seen, and the people that I quoted here, most of them are sort of more negative scenarios, but in those cases, they saw these sort of negative behaviors, the pushiness, right, the making things up, the disappearing and not caring. They saw those as confirmations of what they already believed about journalists, that journalists don't care, they're self-serving, right? They're very powerful, these kinds of ideas. And I started to think of this as a deep story about American journalism. So this is an idea that I discuss in the conclusion of my book. I borrow the concept from a sociologist who's very influential named Arlie Hochschild, okay? She most recently wrote a book about Tea Party supporters in Louisiana. And she develops the idea of a deep story to understand their worldview, essentially. Okay, the book is called Strangers in Their Own Land, and I highly recommend it. But essentially, she defines a deep story as a story that feels true to people. Okay, it's a story about the contending forces in their world that helps them to understand a lot of inequalities, right? It resonates with their worldview, and it may not be factually verifiable, but it feels true. Okay, so I think interwoven in what I've described, you can start to see the deep story that people seemed to have bought into about journalism. But I want to show you one more quote that I think drives it home pretty well. So I interviewed a woman named Katie, who was the owner of a restaurant in New York. This restaurant was kind of an institution on the Upper West Side, and it had been threatened with closure due to a sort of bureaucratic problem. But the New York Post, of all papers, wrote a very sympathetic article about this problem, and that ended up being the pressure that she needed to avoid closure. Essentially, she felt that her restaurant had been saved. Her livelihood had been saved because of this article. And so she was very grateful to the reporter, and she was grateful to the newspaper. And to me, listening to her tell this story, I thought, well, this is a classic story of a journalist kind of standing up for the little guy in the face of power. Okay, so we get to the end of the interview, and I said this. I said, is there anything else you think I should know? And she said, my biggest thing is the press has so much power. They should know the power they hold, and they should be ethical. The doctor is there to take care of the patient over anything else. The press is there to tell the truth, and that's been lost. Okay, now let me just say that I think that it's really easy to focus on the telling the truth part of this. Right, and to say this is an argument, she's making an argument about accuracy. But actually, what I think is more important here is the relationship that she's calling attention to, the doctor metaphor, right? So in her mind, the press is supposed to have a particular relationship to the people, and it's not doing that job, right? Over and over, the people that I spoke to talked about journalists and journalistic institutions not as being on their side against power, but as powerful people and institutions in their own right. This was the story, okay? This is the story that I heard over and over and over. And it was worse. It was people who were supposed to be looking out for them and instead were looking out for themselves. Essentially, it was the story of a bully, okay? Now, this is really important and kind of hard to face because it's the exact reverse of the deep story that American journalism tells about itself. Right? In that scenario, journalists look out for people. They stand up to power on the behalf of the people, right? And yet, the story that I was hearing, I think, is more widespread. This idea that journalism is kind of a bullying institution, very, very powerful. I think it's more widespread than is generally recognized. But you know who knows it really well is this guy. Okay, so he's tapping into these widespread, what I really do believe are more widespread attitudes than is generally recognized. But I think this is an important point to emphasize here at the end, partly because, we're having all these conversations about trust. But before you can talk about how to regain trust or instill trust, you need to understand how people are thinking about you, right? In this case, it really is as these powerful institutions that often have motives that are more self-serving than they are in the public service, right? So I think I'll stop there and ask if Anna has any questions and if the audience does.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, because you made me feel like my job is necessary in a way. What do you think of the lack of public editors in media?
So can you hear me? Using this mic? This is something that I take up in the conclusion of my book. I think public editors are really, really important. In fact, when I wrote the conclusion, the New York Times still had a public editor. And one of the recommendations that I made is that more institutions should have public editors. And ideally, I think public editors would actually work closely with the community. And so kind of the ideal scenario would, in fact, be almost a committee of community members who are non-journalists who work closely with a public editor. And I say that partly because a public editor has credibility in newsrooms because they're journalists, because he or she is a journalist. And so I think that credibility is important. But I also think that part of what comes from immersion in newsrooms is that it becomes hard to see how non-journalists see the profession. And so I think that being in touch with the community is really, really important. But in general, I think public editors play an absolutely vital role in representing the people, partly because, as I've emphasized, people really don't feel like they feel like news institutions are very, very powerful, right?
What do you feel? I mean, give me a suggestion of what you think we should do to do our job better. I mean, do you think we should explain to people how newspapers or how news organizations work and try to make them communicate with each other, or should we side all the time with the people without really siding with the journalists? Should we help the conversation? I think I have that feeling that we should be doing that.
Yes, I think as much outreach and conversation as possible. I think in general, journalistic institutions should make more of an effort to explain how their work works.
Yeah.
Because this is something that I
found. We take it for granted, right?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to take it for granted that people, I think partly because journalistic products are so public and so visible, it's easy to imagine that the processes are public and visible too, right? But in fact, people don't understand necessarily how journalism works. And if you think about it, we don't assume that, people are naive if they don't understand how doctors do their work or other professions work, right? That's professional expertise, right? But for some reason, we have a tendency to, I think those of us who study journalism and focus on it a lot, to assume that people really understand how the sausage gets made. And I don't think they do. Yeah. And I think that could go a long way toward helping people appreciate the difficulty of the job, but also the reasons why errors occur. People don't know that. Why certain choices are made. They don't know that either. I was speaking to a journalist earlier this week who was saying that, sometimes people would come to her and say, well, the choice of using this shorter word shows bias. And really, the shorter word was used because there wasn't space for the bigger word. Yeah. Little things like that, people just don't know. Yeah. And I think it can go a long way toward building trust to just be to try to incorporate more of a teaching aspect to the job. I fully recognize that is, we're asking journalists to do a lot, right, with few resources.
So let me interrupt you. Yeah. Can I ask you, do you sympathize more with the journalists or with the public? When you were doing this work, who were you siding with?
Well, when you read it, who did you think I was siding with?
Well, I felt you understood the journalists, but you were siding with the people.
Yeah. I think that it was hard not to, I tried not to do that too much, but it was a little bit my tendency, partly because they really don't have a lot of power in this exchange. They're very different from public figures. Yeah. you know? And I think a lot of what we think of as best practice in journalism is designed for interactions with public figures.
Now, do you think we should stop interviewing the common people when there are accidents or when there are those events? I mean, do you think we should stop? Is it a practice that you think should stop because we're not doing a good job with it, and we should just do the interviews with the public figures and stop talking to the people?
No, I don't. And I mean, I think, as I said, you know, speaking through the press is a great opportunity for people who don't normally have a chance to address the public. And I think it's a misconception that the people that we see interviewed in the news don't know. I think we often think, oh, they don't know what they're doing.
No.
Right? They're just being pressured by journalists. In fact, I found that they usually did. You know, they wanted to talk to journalists, to witness to an event, to call attention to things. But I would say that I think, you know, as the example I gave of the accident witness sort of emphasizes, it is important to be, to approach people who've just been through something traumatic in an understanding way.
Yeah,
right.
Of course.
So
well, the best journalists usually do.
I think you're right. Yeah,
they get more information if they do it.
Yeah, I think that's true.
If they're nudging instead of pushing.
Right, and coming in more. To be fair, I think print journalists have, in a way, more leeway to approach gently.
Than the broadcasting journalists with a push
you know, they're under a deadline and all of this. But I think in that scenario, clearly, it seems pretty clear that from the subject's point of view, it would have been better for the journalist to say, you know, are you okay? Are you okay?
Yeah.
We'd like to interview you. And to actually be sympathetic before the camera went on.
Yeah.
Because that's what people want. It's not phony sympathy, it's actual sympathy.
But good journalists, I mean...
should do that, yeah.
I mean, let me make a case for the journalists. I mean, there's journalists, and journalists are not all the same.
No.
You know, if I have to explain journalists to people, I would say, you know, we are humans, and there's the good ones, the less good ones, the bad ones, and the very bad ones. So we're not all the same. We're all different.
Yeah.
So talk to the good ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is that the people that I spoke to...
You can choose, too, who to talk to.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I think that would be a good thing to educate people more on, is that diversity. Because one of the things...
If they read papers and they follow the news on television or online, they can figure out who's good and who's not as good.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to assume that more people have that kind of time than necessarily do. But I agree with you. But I think that would be something that we could educate people more about, is the differences between different kinds of journalists. Partly because, you know, what I think is so unfair, really, in a lot of ways about this deep story is that people did tend to lump all journalists into this big media blob. And they had negative ideas about that blob. And the journalists that came to mind for them as sort of being examples of this were TV journalists who they had seen abusing people.
Yeah.
You know, they talked about those things. Those were the ones that were most accessible to them. And so, you know, that's the image of journalists that I think, broadly speaking, the profession has to work against. But it's important that they understand that that's the image people have in their minds in order to be able to try to address it and change that attitude.
Do you still think that there's a need for journalism?
Oh gosh, yes.
Okay,
I mean, more
good.
now than ever. No, I mean, and I'm sorry if you got this sense that I was so unsympathetic because, you know, it's so vital. Sure.
Of course. Now, the Vox Populi, I mean, there's different kinds of people that are being interviewed, not just the victims of accidents, but also a lot of people are being interviewed just because they happen to be on the street and there's an event. And to get a colorful story, journalists need to have the Vox Populi.
Yeah.
So Vox Populi, it's typical, whether it's a football game or if the journalism festival. I mean, I'm directing a master's degree in journalism, and my students go around and ask people, so how do you feel? What do you think about this festival? And they're getting Vox Populi. They're getting people, whoever stops by and wants to talk, they talk. And so you get the people who are really wanting to be in front of a microphone, who love appearing in public, and the people who are really shy, right?
Yeah.
So depending on the ability of the journalists to do the Vox Populi, they get good or bad quotes or very banal quotes that are not interesting. So, and you wrote about Vox Populi, so will you tell them, because you only talked about the accidents.
I didn't talk about that so much. So In a lot of ways, these kind of person on the street interviews are the lowest stakes interviews for people. You know, they're not actually that invested in those stories in most cases.
But they want to appear.
But they do, and there's a variety, as you said. You know, some people are not interested in the attention. But some people said to me, I'm just the type of person, like if I see a journalist, I'm gonna go right for him. Right? So there are some people that just enjoy it. You know, they have a performative impulse. It's exciting, right? So this is something that I talk about in the book that I didn't emphasize. There's an excitement. This is out of the ordinary. It can feel kind of flattering that the journalist wants to talk to you. You're gonna be on TV. Your friends will see you. You'll get to post it on social media. People will congratulate you. That's fun. And so there's actually a playful quality to the Vox Pop for the subjects that enjoy that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know?
So a Vox Pop is also very useful for the media to kind of advertise itself. Because in a way, if you go in the streets and do a Vox Pop, you tend to make people go and click on the website or go and watch the TV show, the TV news piece, or buy the paper to see your quote and show to your mom, hey, I'm in the newspaper today, right? Yeah. So since we're in such a big crisis and there's a model business, the business model is in crisis, using people to enlarge the audience is kind of a subconscious way of journalists to survive. Do you agree with that, or do you think we're doing it more and more because we need more attention because we're afraid people won't read us? Only the public figures read us and not the people.
Gosh,
have you ever thought of that?
I haven't really thought about that.
Yeah, because I think that's an attitude also. That we feel like we are writing so much about public leaders, we interview public leaders, that it seems like we are writing the newspaper or the magazine for them and not for people. And so then we feel, okay, well, let's put up a Vox Pop piece also to make it more popular and broaden our audience.
Well, I think it's a good idea. Because I do think that part of this larger question of how people feel about news and their attitudes toward news includes an idea that, in a lot of ways it's a feeling, okay? And I don't think we talk about that enough. We sort of tend to think of people's attitudes toward journalism as being based entirely on some sort of cold assessment of the content that's being presented to them, right? If it's accurate content, I will trust, right? But in fact, it's something more than that. And I think, the best research on this suggests that, people trust or feel kind of a trust impulse toward news organizations that reflect back to them something of their world experience, right? And that doesn't have to mean literally that they're seeing people in the news that are exactly like them all the time, but they need to have a sense that they're having something reflected back to them that is familiar in some way and resonates with their worldview. And so it would seem to me, in theory, that part of that would mean the inclusion of more kind of ordinary people, in the news.
I have one last question, and then I would like to leave it to the audience. But it's a very tricky issue. The issue that you brought about the right to be forgotten. I mean, in Europe we have that, and it's pretty clear, and we're applying it actually. In the newspaper I work for, but I'm sure many other Europeans do the same, readers call us up and they ask us to untag a story, to unpublish a story, because before going to Google and asking Google, they call directly the publisher. And if we feel they have a right for that, we go and check, because the checks and balances on the right to report something and keep that online. Sure. Because there's a history, and it's our right to give that a story, and then the right of the individual to unpublish it if it's not newsworthy anymore and it has nothing, and it destroys their reputation. Then we try to balance that out, and every single case is a different case. So we decide day by day. And but that's not done very much in the U.S., is it?
It's not done at all. In the U.S., there's not a right to be. So here, I think probably most people are familiar with the right to be forgotten. But the idea here would be that, mostly it's a matter of your right to contact
search engines, so specifically Google usually, and ask them to remove links to stories so that when people Google your name, the story won't come up. So in most cases, if you petition Google and you make the case that the story is no longer relevant, it's not important that this be known, they review these petitions, and they can, if they agree, they'll remove the link. Which basically removes the problem that I was talking about before. In most cases, those stories still remain in the archives online. So it's not like this, the archives of the news organization. So it's not like the story disappears completely, but if you Google a person because you're gonna hire them or something, the article doesn't necessarily, it would no longer pop up.
That's why they call us most of the time.
Right, and so in the US, this is not a legal recourse that's available, and it won't ever be, basically, I think because of the primacy of free speech there, and the freedom of the press. And so it's never going to be a possibility.
But it's never going to be a possibility to call the news organization instead of
I mean,
Google?
I suppose you could call the news organization. I don't know.
The public editor?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could contact them. It's hard to imagine them ever, you know.
I'm the one who gets contacted.
And you sometimes do?
They send me all the time. They send me emails and they say, the story about my son is not relevant anymore. Can you please ask the newspaper to remove it? And
they'll remove the article.
Yeah, we remove the article.
Oh,
if it's relevant, if he's right.
Yeah,
if he's right.
I've never heard of that happening in the U.S., but you know, maybe
in
a lot of ways it's a better question for you.
We've been doing it more and more because readers. I mean, but it's a case-by-case story. So if it's someone who's looking for a job and he said, my son will never get a job if this article. He was a bully when he was young, but he was, you know, he was a minor. Maybe we made the mistake of writing the story of a minor, and we have an ethics code in the newspaper, and actually in Italy for journalists that we're not supposed to write names and recognizable faces of minors. He was a minor, but the story came out with a picture and everything, and the guy, because he was a bully and he did something that was wrong in school. And then he grew up, and now he's grown up and he's looking for a job. And they Google him, and he can't get a job because he was stupid.
This is what happens, right?
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine an American news institution doing that. It's just our attitude about naming people in stories tends to be that the public's right to know this information trumps personal privacy. And there are all sorts of historical reasons why that is a greater emphasis than in Europe. You know, here we kind of prioritize privacy a little bit more. But that's very, very interesting. And actually, you know, I am sympathetic to that practice. You know, because.
But it's got to be done in a very measured and sensitive way.
In case by case.
In case by case, and there's also individual responses. I mean, not every journalist feels the same way, and we all have our own sensitivities. So, it's a very difficult and tricky issue.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead. Which one is first? Which one is first? You? Okay, you and then you. Okay.
So I'm really interested in the fact that you think public editors play a really important role in the public sphere. In my experience, they tend to be more reactive than proactive. So I'm interested in how what kind of advice you would give in terms of how public editors should work more closely with community as opposed to just receiving emails or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think ideally there would be community representatives that would kind of, you know, serve a certain tenure and be on a sort of public editor committee and would be continually informing a public editor during their sort of tenure. So maybe in a matter of months or a year or something like this. You know, and the reason why I think that's important is because obviously public editors and journalists in general have limited resources, but they need to be more continually having these conversations, right? And having conversations with people who are not deeply steeped in newsroom culture. Okay, so that would be one recommendation. You know, I'm very sensitive to the fact that public editors do have these limited resources, but in fact, I think, you know, they need a team, right? And I think that changing journalistic culture to or newsroom culture so that it is more conversational, it's having more proactive conversations and trying to generate community more is really important. I've been to some really terrific panels here where that's been the main discussion. So I do see that in some cases there's an emphasis on that, and it's really important. You're welcome.
Question? Yes. The one in front, yeah, and then you.
Thank you for a super, super, super interesting talk.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So this was really a lot of worst practices. What would the best practices look like? You mentioned that, you know, that there are great stuff happening between a journalist and a subject. What does that look like?
Well, you know, in the book I do talk about some of them. And in the best case scenarios, you know, one of the reasons why it's a little bit hard to talk about them is that they actually feel to subjects as collaborative. And I think that journalists resist feeling like they're collaborating with sources, right? But from the point of view of some of the people that I spoke to, the creation of an article was a collaboration with the journalist. Okay, so that was the case in some cases for profiles. They felt that the journalist approached them. The ideal situation is that the journalist approaches you with a very open mind, open to what you have to say. So that would be true if they're doing a profile, and that would be true if they're looking for a quote. You know, and this is one way where I think journalistic, sort of the pressures on journalists to produce stories quickly, fundamentally sort of can butt up against the needs of subjects, right? If you're a subject, you want the journalist to be very open-minded to whatever you have to say, even if it doesn't fit the slot that they have left in their article, because the article's mostly already been written, okay? So coming to subjects with a very open mind and listening carefully and really hearing what they have to say, I think that's one thing. Especially approaching people who've just been through traumatic events with as sincere a sympathetic sort of demeanor as possible. Right? So you may not have been there, but trying to understand that this person was, and they're upset, and being really sympathetic before the camera goes on, and making sure that they're okay, first and foremost, I think that's really important, right? I also think that in terms of sort of creating a sense of trust with at least the individual people that you're including in your stories, it really is important for them to feel like they know how to get in touch with you. And I mean, maybe this was something that reporters would absolutely wince at, but conveying that you wouldn't mind hearing from them later, right? So you wouldn't mind, you know, it's okay for them to call you after the story comes out. And let them, so they could at least say, you know, this is what happened, and feel like someone cares. Because I think that's the big takeaway from the worst practices, is that they tend to emphasize this larger idea that people have that journalists don't care. And that's not true in a lot of cases, right? So best practice would generally be all of these different ways that I think journalists can convey that they do, right?
More questions?
Oh, we have to finish.
Two more. Okay. Yes.
Oh, well. Okay. Well, we can talk after. I'll stick around.
We're running out of time, so we keep doing questions outside. Thank you very much. And
Thank you all for coming.
Applause.